Please rise in body or spirit and join in singing hymn 188. We'll sing it through 3 times.
Please join me in the reading for lighting the chalice. We light this chalice to celebrate Unitarian Universalism. This is the church of the open mind. This is the church of the helping hands. This is the church of the loving heart. Together we care for the church and each other. Good morning. We are delighted to have Leigh Waltz as a guest in the pulpit this morning. My name is Ravensong, and Reverend Alice, Diebel, and I will be assisting with worship. A little about Leigh. The Unitarian Universalist seminarian and ministerial aspirant Leigh Waltz brings an eclectic background and an amazing life to his ministry. A theologian and philosopher, artist and filmmaker, a world wanderer, and a universe ponderer, Leigh is from Dayton, Ohio, and now lives in Tip City. But at the age of 18, he began a lifetime of journeying and religious exploration, living in East Malaysia, first with a Muslim family and then a Catholic family. He says that in 1 year, when he turned 18, he attended a Catholic school, a Muslim funeral, Sikh services, Taoist services, Catholic masses, and visited a Buddhist shrine, a Hindu shrine, and the list goes on. He has worked on a farm in Germany, attended the University of Vienna, received a degree in cinema studies in Los Angeles, and worked in the movie business there. He served in the Navy fleet and in Iraq. He taught art, drawing, and photography. He has written 2 screenplays. He describes himself as an artist, a writer, a seeker, and a mystic. Again, we want to welcome Leigh to the pulpit. St. John's is proud to be a welcoming congregation, and as such, we honor and value the racial, economic, cultural, age, physical ability, sexual orientation, and gender diversity of our members and our visitors. Whether you are joining us in person or online, know that you have a place here. Know also that wherever you are in your journey and however you are feeling, you are welcome here, and we're happy you chose to be with us today. A special welcome to visitors this morning. I invite you to stop by the welcome table in our lobby and to join us for refreshments and conversation in our fellowship hall after the service. As a reminder, please turn off or silence your cell phones, and again, welcome to all this morning. Now, if everyone will join us in hymn number 148, Let Freedom Span Both East and West. Now please join me in our affirmation of faith. This is the mission of our faith, to teach the fragile art of hospitality, to revere both the critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to witness to all that we must hold the whole world in our hands. At this time during our service, we have a tradition where we express our joys and concerns by coming forward and putting a stone in the bowl of sand. So if you will come forward now.
We place final stones in the bowl to honor any unspoken or unexpressed joys and sorrows today. Ravensong lights a candle to carry the light forward through our week to come. And now we have Ashley Rhodes, our Director of Programs for Children and Youth. She has a story.
Good morning. So yes, I am Ashley Rhodes, the Director of Programs for Children and Youth today, and we're going to talk just a little bit about freedom, just a little bit, because that's, what holiday is coming up? What's going to happen in a couple of days? The 4th of July. But I'm not going to talk about fireworks or even our country's independence. I'm going to talk about what happened in Huntsville, Alabama in 1962. So the big thing you need to know about Huntsville, Alabama is that in 1962, the space program was a big deal. They were building rockets. Like, that was a huge deal there. So you have to think about, like, this town and, like, a lot of money, like, they were really reliant on, and it was a really exciting time. They were going to the moon. They were building rockets. But then there was also a lot of other stuff going on. At that time, Huntsville was segregated, meaning that black people and white people didn't use a lot of the same things. Like, black people couldn't sit at the lunch counters where white people ate. And in January of 1962, like in a lot of other places at that time, they started having sit-ins. So black people, often students, would go and sit at the lunch counters and sit there, even though they weren't allowed, usually until they got arrested. And they kept doing that because they wanted things to change. Now, I'm talking about Huntsville in particular because because of what happened, because of how things went. So they had protests. They also had, there was, one of the situations that they had was that a college student and one woman who was pregnant and another woman who was a wife of a dentist who had a baby in her arms protested at a lunch counter, and they wouldn't leave until they got arrested. And they even arrested the baby, and the baby went to jail. And of course, that made national news. And so that was a big deal. And keep in mind, they were, relying on defense contract money, and the people who were in charge of this town started to get, maybe we don't look so great about this. And there were other things that happened that spring. They had, now, at that time, people would always buy new clothes for Easter. So it was a big deal for the stores in that town. And people coordinated in Huntsville and other places to, instead of buying their fancy new hats and their fancy new shoes and their fancy new dresses, they bought blue jeans. Now, at that time, only farmers wore blue jeans, and women didn't wear pants at all. But for this particular Sunday, they made it Blue Jean Sunday. And the businesses in town felt that. They calculated that they lost $1 million, and that was in 1962. So they noticed. One of the other things they did was when George Wallace came to town, a little bit after Mother's Day, they rode around and they sent balloons up into the sky that had pieces of paper attached to them that said, "Please support freedom in Huntsville." And they landed all over town. And lots of things like that happened. And so here's the outcome of that. This was, in the context of a lot of things happening that year and in that decade. But the big thing that happened in July of 1962 in Huntsville was that the city leaders and civil rights leaders got together, and they just decided to integrate the downtown of Huntsville. They talked the downtown businesses into it, and they said, we're just going to do this. And they chose a day, and they chose a time, and they chose certain lunch counters, and a bunch of people. So they had people who were chosen to do it, sat down at lunch counters, and the black people who were sitting down said, "Is this okay?" And the white server said, "This is what we're doing, right?" And there were policemen around who were not in uniform who were trying to make sure that things didn't get difficult. And it didn't. and peaceful integration. It just, 6 months after they started doing sit-ins, 61 years ago, July of 1962, downtown Huntsville, Alabama integrated. Now, you can't argue that that happened in a vacuum, but it happened. It worked. Now, another thing that happened in Huntsville, now, at that time, they were also trying to integrate schools, which there was a lot of difficulty around that. But one of the things that happened the next year was that a private school for black students, without any fanfare, accepted 12 white students. And that was the first instance of reverse integration. Absolutely no fanfare whatsoever. It just, went fine. So the reason I decided to talk about that today was that sometimes, freedom takes a lot of work to achieve, and sometimes it doesn't go very well. But sometimes, when we work toward what freedom looks like, people get together, and it just works. Yeah? Okay, so on that note, we are going to go outside. So thank you very much for listening.
We'll sing the children out. Thank you. Will you please join me in a spirit of prayer or meditation? We have some sorrows and joys from our community here. There's a joy from Kathy and Dave Rentz. Michael Rentz and Angela Min were married in Chicago on June 17th. And they're going to live in Milwaukee. Leigh will be the faculty at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And Angela will be preparing for her nurse practitioner exam in adult medicine. Fantastic. And a sorrow from David Strecker. Rebecca Crone and her son Kinta are both dealing with medical issues. Hopefully they'll be okay. Please hold them in your prayers. Living Spirit that moves among us, within us and beyond us, dear God, we are grateful for our time together where we share strength and common purpose. There's much to think about in the world, mass shootings every day, more than every day. A Supreme Court that allows discrimination against LGBTQ+ people and ends affirmative action, putting vulnerable people at risk. May we bring our actions together to work against these kinds of discriminations that are codified in our Constitution. We hold in our hearts all among us who may be suffering from illness, may we be that community that holds one another in a cup of care and kindness. We're also grateful for those among us who are volunteering to keep the work of this church going. An old board steps back and a new board steps up. We're grateful to be together. We're grateful to share values. May we live our lives in the way our faith describes. Amen. Blessed be. Oh, one other sorrow. Yesterday we buried Gary Cook's ashes in the Heritage Acres garden. There are 2 carnations in the vase here representing Gary's death. And I'm grateful for those who came for that small service in the rain. Amen. We will now collect the offering that is generously given and gratefully received for the work of this congregation moving forward in the world.
Today's reading is from Isaiah 42, 1 through 9. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I have to no other, nor my praise to idols. See, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare before they spring forth. I tell you of them. Now, if you will join me in hymn number 146, Soon the Day Will Arrive.
Good morning. I'm going to go off script right off the bat. When this was quite a few weeks ago, as I experienced it, when I asked what you would like me to talk about, and when Reverend Alice said freedom, I had to cry. I've been working since, I think, last August on spending $4,000 next Sunday for a presentation called Springs to Freedom. And that involves the bringing of 32 slaves 160 years ago to Yellow Springs by the guy who used to preach at the church you're going to be at next weekend. I want to thank my friend Reverend Alice Diebel and all of you for this opportunity to worship together. Ravensong just read the first servant song of Isaiah. A little warning, I'm a mystic. I'm still on a high from General Assembly. The first servant song can be thought of as a poet's expression of a sense of duty in the realization of a very high ideal. Putting it more simply, for other people, it could be thought of the voice of God talking to someone who's thinking about obeying God. That has to do with the self. Isaiah mentions the holy road folks have traditionally taken comfort in bringing out the prisoners of a figurative prison. I say the Holy Road and releasing prisoners have stuff in common. Every man, says the Talmud, every man believes he is righteous, yet we end up causing harm. This is a discourse on freedom and an appeal to you and God by an artist vagabond who's becoming a ministerial aspirant. Artists want freedom of thought, of choice, of expression for creation, and the works of my hand and mind had to do with God before I heard the still small voice. Being lost is a kind of prison. It is oppressive. We have to ask if our freedom impinges on someone else's. If I'm morally asleep, I'm probably an oppressor. Am I right? Letters made their way out of a Vietnamese refugee camp in West Malaysia in 1979. The government had built a fence around them about 100 yards from where their boat landed. They were given fish, rice, water, and not much else. Our visit was interesting. We were free to go. The Vietnamese were not. When we got in the big shiny car belonging to the Minister of State and drove off, I quietly told our chaperone that I had maybe 20 letters stuffed down the front of my pants. He said, "Shh, so do I." We mailed those letters in the next town. We were learning about freedom in dialogue with oppression. 3 years later, 2 Iraqis who were stuck in Vienna spent the weekend with me in my apartment. My new friend had heard fighting and shouting in the University of Baghdad dorm at night, and the next morning when he saw his classmates hung by the neck dead from lampposts and trees because they had protested against a guy named Saddam Hussein, who I'd never heard of, he decided it was a good time to leave the country. That's oppression. The dead had signs hanging around their necks with the name of the student group that he'd been a member of. After the weekend at my apartment, they invited me to stay with them in Budapest, and I was welcomed by them and many other refugees from Iraq. I had a pleasant stay, and as I was seen off at the train station, I asked my friend, he gave me his address, and it was in Syria. And I asked why, and he said if he used his Iraqi address, it would endanger the lives of his family. When I asked, what are you going to do? He said he was going back to fight against Saddam Hussein. We were learning about freedom. January 17th, 1993, as my ship fired 12 cruise missiles into Baghdad, I thought about Dia. That was his name. There's also a prison of self-gratification. People make money by selling us illusions. We Americans are desperately comfortable. We generate our own illusions too. We have every possible luxury, and we believe that stuff has meaning, especially new and improved stuff. But our kids are often afraid that they'll be shot at school or in a mall by some confused, angry mass shooter, and many kids think the boomers have destroyed the planet. It's more like runaway train capitalism or zombie capitalism. I was a little shocked at General Assembly when they said that the money people don't think we should divest in petroleum stuff. I recently heard a minister say, wherever real worship is, there has to be sacrifice. And I've been thinking a lot about that. Even thinking figuratively, there's something there. Desperately comfortable people don't want to make much sacrifice. I'm not so sure about the blood atonement, but there is advice from the atonement guy that says if you go to the altar and there discover that there is something you owe your brother, go fix that before making your offering. We're supposed to lighten our hearts before making our offering. That's freedom. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 24. The sacrifice we offer is our presence, being in the present. It is our keeping our consciences clear. That's portable. Our engagement with that is our ministry. Our abilities and talents are God's gifts to us, and what we do with those, done rightly, becomes our gifts to God. Everyone is in the ministry of freedom, or they're asleep. Gandhi called the conscience the highest court. If we let our consciences guide us, our gifts will become rightly offered, and we will start to experience the kind of freedom intended by the Most High. Similar to Matthew chapter 5, verse 24, the prophet Muhammad said, if something pricks your conscience, abandon that. That's about freedom. Psalm 119, verse 45 says, and I will walk in complete freedom because I have sought your commands. That seems like theory, but it gets very practical when we experience the pain caused by not paying attention. The only person who I thought cried as much as I did in treatment confided to me that when he was a teenager with zero motive, he rode up on his bike and killed a man with a pistol and rode away. He said he thought he got away with it, but it was eating him alive. Bondage is the opposite of freedom, and we can be bound by our desire, our attachment, our appetites, our unjust laws, our mistakes, our inability to forgive ourselves or others. I like the statement that virtue limits suffering. Let's say that out loud. Virtue limits suffering. If some lady takes whatever she wants, eats all the time, has sex with whomever and whenever, and she decides truth or lying don't matter, and she's more important than everybody else, eventually, if disease, fatigue, and families don't remove her or apprehend her or intervene, the police probably will. Or lately, some folks down south might try to get her elected to the Senate. We all attend this school of hard knocks. If we wake up, we tend to cultivate virtue and cause less harm. We can distinguish the pleasant from the good. The pleasant is sweet in the beginning and bitter at the end. The good is bitter in the beginning and sweet at the end. Some grow quicker than others. I want to help us all be Unitarian Universalists. A lady heard Emerson speak, and she asked him, was not Christ sinless? He answered, knowledge of good and evil through experience is an essential condition of intelligence, and that wisdom can hardly be denied Jesus. We figure out that virtue limits suffering. Some try harder than others. The only difference between a sinner and a saint is a saint doesn't give up. That tenacity is key. Escaping oppression is a form of freedom, and it tends to keep us thinking literally. And we tend to imagine the grass is greener on the other side and things like that. Even if we are reminded that enough is abundant to the wise, money is very slippery. We think it confers freedom, but it usually puts us on our backs spiritually. There isn't enough time for dealing with the whole issue of money and freedom. But suffice it to say that according to United Airlines training, my wife's a flight attendant for United Airlines, there are more slaves now than at any time in history. Human trafficking is a problem. I was walking through the Atlanta airport, and there's a giant poster of a little girl in an airplane seat, and she's crying. And the whole thing is about human trafficking. Involuntary servitude becomes invisible if kept in isolation and if the oppression is kept to a certain level. A man from Senegal explained to our UU fellowship that many slaves don't know they're slaves until someone tells them. That's confusing until you hear that the 3-year-old was sold and raised on the back porch, and he carried firewood and water for years and years in exchange for clothing, food, and his little cot. It becomes his normal life until someone tells him otherwise. Stating the otherwise to a slave might simply shatter their innocence or their worldview and take away their peace. Once there is objective awareness, there comes a duty to liberate. Am I right? I mean, telling someone that they're a slave without pointing to the exit, or perhaps explaining how to get through the exit, or even taking them through the exit, seems unkind or inappropriate. Seeking complete liberation, Emerson thought, suggests self-reliance before self-realization. And self-realization to perennial philosophers is a euphemism for liberation. He had read the books that make clear that our possessions possess us, and we kind of see that the spiritual teachers across many cultures don't really own much stuff. Emerson's protege, Moncure Conway, who preached at the First Unitarian Church in Cincinnati, a mile and a half that way, said that Virginians of his time were slaves to slavery. Contemporary sustainability author Rob Hopkins points out that 1 liter of petroleum contains the energy equivalent of having 37 full-time slaves. And I don't want to take away anybody's car or anybody's cigarettes, but we think of our gas consumption as freedom when it is mostly consumerism. We've let ourselves become accustomed to consumerism, and now it is almost strangling the life out of us. Easy, easy, easy is the path to a bitter end. I speak as a repentant grasshopper among ants. We can become victims of our own freedom. It creates a value that, over-cherished, becomes selfishness and gluttony and other forms of vice. No one can tell me what to do is not freedom. Where's the love in that formulation? I think we see this in our society. My wife reminds me whenever we see a yellow flag with a coiled rattlesnake on it, the little caption underneath it actually says, "Don't read to me." As I visit the elderly and infirm, some of them long for freedom, long for the freedom of death, and they say so. There's not much that truly feels like freedom while we sit around waiting to die. Our purpose is our freedom, right up unto this last. For an awakened one, the agony in the garden is worse than the agony on the cross. Our heart suffers more than the mind or the body, especially if we cultivated that over a long term, if we cultivate love, if we cultivate charity. Immortality would become oppression without some serious adaptation. If you saw the movie Groundhog Day or read Vedic wisdom or the New Testament, we can intuit that compassion and love offer the kind of gratification that can operate as freedom on the mortal plane and theoretically beyond. What do we do with the fact that we live a life, grow old, and die? Wise men of the East determined that liberation was getting off the wheel of death and rebirth. To consumers, this doesn't make too much sense. If we never think a transcendent thought, we are eaters of food and fillers of latrines. Freedom's allure is to the transcendence of the ugliest realities we create for ourselves and each other. Mortality seems like oppression to one who is attached to the ego and to gratification of the senses. Rockefeller said, "Old age is a shipwreck." But the Apostle Paul practiced dying every day. The flip side of slavery or servitude is that it can be a powerful connector if used voluntarily and devotionally. That is the path of service. One could call it devotional yoga or bhakti yoga. Bob Smith, he's the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, said, "Everyone knows what love is, and everyone knows what service is." What that doesn't say is that not everyone knows experientially. If theory gets tested in practice, especially driven by our ideals, most spiritual heroes and sheroes would say that love and service lead to freedom. They might use the word moksha. I thought I had made a discovery as an artist. If you stare at something long enough while you're drawing it, there comes a point when you're in relationship with that object. It can get pretty intense. And as you continue, the mind will suggest and you will come to wonder, how connected to a streetlight or a table can I be? When you start to intuit that you and the table could be the same stuff, even the same thing, and then when your drawing is finished, you realize that that relationship connecting you to everything existed before you discovered it. Now you belong to a pretty big family. The sages realize the world is one family. If you get to that point, it's impossible to meet a stranger. Othering is impossible. Fear is impossible. This sort of waking up is called satori, but it needs to be cultivated again and again and again. This is personal freedom par excellence, but it would remain secret if not expressed. It would remain secret if not shared. It would remain secret if not talked about. The return from that journey is a form of sacrifice. Participation is the offering. The pinnacle of freedom expressed is mortal generosity. We give our lives. We dedicate our lives. Consciously or not, we consecrate our lives. Service is freedom. The identification with witness consciousness and unitive consciousness confers radical freedom, far-reaching and thorough freedom. The Buddha found compassion as the access point to this, an innovation to get into unitive consciousness. And the Jesus innovation in that effort is love. Love is broader, it aims in more directions than compassion. Radical freedom is the fruit of the inward journey brought into our lives with our fellows. The new freedom is the realization of co-identification. What is here is also there. What is there is also here. Radical freedom is perceiving and understanding our interconnectedness. That perception brings harmony. I invite you and charge you to notice and watch yourselves and each other growing in kindness, patience, love, and freedom. Please join me in the spirit of prayer. Dear God, let greater consciousness come to us upon our arrival and upon our departure and in the eternal present moment so that we can use all your gifts and blessings the better to do your will. Amen.
Thank you, Leigh. Just a couple of announcements. As always, there are announcements on your bulletin. Please take a look at those. I want to point out in particular, next week, July 9th, the service will be at First UU, and it will be at 10 o'clock in the morning. Let me say that again, 10 o'clock in the morning at First UU. If you come here, you will be alone. The address for First UU, if you've never been there, is in the bulletin. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is the wall here, our welcome to Reverend Jen Grayson. Please sign it. There are markers up here. Just come up and sign your name.
Before we begin our final hymn, "Oh, I Woke Up This Morning," which is number 153, I think about the holiday that's coming, July 4th, and I'm reminded of the words of Frederick Douglass, who wrote the meaning of July 4th for the Negro in 1852. Douglass says, "What to the American slave is the 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim." This hymn is an African-American spiritual sung by people who were not free. Singing gave people comfort and hope in these horrific circumstances of slavery. We sing these songs remembering our history and honoring those who have suffered. Perhaps think of it as a resistance revival. Please rise in body and spirit and join in hymn 153.
The peace of God which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God, and the blessing of God Almighty be upon you and remain always. Amen.